Now, in the past, I have spoken about various Canton topics, and I tend to do that because Canton isn't covered too often. But the last time I did, I think all I've heard since is you need to speak on the circus. And so that was certainly one topic I hadn't covered yet, and so I learned quite a bit just even getting ready for the program. And so hopefully you'll learn something tonight. So the year is 1886, and the place is Horseheads, New York. And Lee and Scribner's Circus had just entered their 1886 season and decided to part ways, each of them taking with them the circus equipment, animals, and staff that belonged to them. Charles Lee decided to start his own circus, which would be called Charles Lee's Great London Show. And by the end of 1887, he was on his way to winter quarters in Muncie. His advance men had soon arrived in Canton ahead of the show, and early in August, the Canton Sentinel had announced that Charles Lee's Great London Railroad Shows and Congress of Trained Animals was on its way to Canton. Now, the railroad had nothing to do with it, but Lee thought that was a good advertising gimmick. An ad appeared in the Canton Sentinel announcing the show date of Monday, August the 22nd, with admission of 25 cents. It would feature 25 leading gymnasts, tumblers, leapers, jugglers, slackwire performers, 3 of the finest clowns on earth, the best bar and trapeze performers in the world, and Mrs. Charles Lee's troupe of educated ponies, dogs, goats, and monkeys. The children's delight, who they called Brigham, the little Japanese riding dog, and the wild Mustang pony Topsy would be present. The Canton Sentinel reported, "We assure our readers that this company is one of the long-standing and merited reputation and cannot be classed with the high-flung claptraps that frequently come around with great pretensions and little execution." While showing in Canton, Lee was impressed with the hospitality of Canton citizens and decided to investigate Canton as a possibility for the future base of operations for his circus. He was looking for a winter quarters, basically, for his circus to reside in. Now, Mr. Lee, in the off-season, was also a magician as well, and so he was a busy guy all year around. And looking for a house, he found this one just off from the main square in Canton on Cummings Street, and it was vacant at the time. And so he grabbed a hold of it and was able to rent the house. And there was a large barn connected out back that would be large enough to contain his equipment. And so therefore, he moved in. The animals were stored at different places around town, and he could make repairs and store his other equipment in the barn there at the house. Now, Lee was very meticulous about the look of his show and the impression that it made on the public. And the May 1889 Springfield Press said, "They made an excellent street parade, everything looking clean, new, and bright. At the ground, everybody was treated with the utmost politeness and every attention paid to make it as pleasant for the audience as possible. The circus performance, given in one large ring and on elevated stage, was first class in every respect and far ahead of the usual traveling show. We will be glad to welcome the Lee Show again at any time." Now, the circus season lasted usually from spring until fall. And in 1890, it was reported that they had traveled through 7 states, including Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and New Jersey, for a total of 1,634 miles, performing 2 shows almost each day in each of 140 towns. That's an awful lot of work. In May of 1891, Lee showed at Troy in a downpour of rain, During the night, the heavy circus wagons started off towards Burlington because they traveled at night in order to reach the next town in the morning. The first wagon was drawn by a 4-horse team driven by Walter Rockwell, shown here, and was crossing the old covered bridge at Long's Mill. And this is actually the bridge that replaced that one, but it's the same location, just out of sight of Troy. And at the time, because of the rain weakening the center pier that you see there under the bridge was literally unsafe, especially for circus wagons to be crossing. And so as he pulled onto the bridge gave way, dropping him into the current and carrying him over the dam. Mr. Rockwell was underwater then and unbuttoned his slicker, slid out of it, and swam to safety. No one was killed in the accident. Now, the Troy Gazette-Register printed an account in 1931 of this story and included the following detail. They said that painted on the stonework of the dam were the words, "Prepare to meet thy God." And it is said that Mr. Rockwell glimpsed them just as he went over the dam. Mrs. Rockwell, in recalling the incident, doubts this part of the story, as she says that he was under the wagon and that when he and his wagon arrived in the pool below, his first thought was that if he had not been killed by that time, he wasn't going to be. By the end of the 1891 season, it was evident that the circus had outgrown its current winter quarters, and in October of 1891, Lee purchased 11 acres of land with house and other buildings east of Canton for $3,000, where he then established winter training quarters for his outfit. Here he built a ring barn to allow circus acts to be practiced during the winter, several buildings for animals, and also enlarged the house. These are pictures, the next 4, of posters that were pasted inside that barn, and John Schaefer in Canton provided these, and the barn is no longer there, but these are pictures of what the posters look like, and many of them show Mr. Lee in the pictures. Of course, they feature all kinds of pictures of acts that they would be performing, and here's a clown that would be performing as part of that. And the new property was just what the circus needed, and Lee put his staff to work giving the circus a facelift and expanding the attractions. And long before the 1892 season started, Lee's press agent was inserting ads like this one and press releases in the Canton Sentinel describing what the public should expect from their show the coming season, including the fact that it would take 100 head of horses to transport the London shows over the road the coming season. The seemingly endless list of circus staff for 1892 could be found in the paper, and included in the list 20 men and their boss just to erect circus tents, the largest tent of which accommodated 3,000 spectators. That's a big tent. The show, the newspaper said, has been enlarged to twice its former size. Carpenters and painters have been busy all winter making preparations for this season, and 2 wardrobe makers have been 2 months engaged in manufacturing ancient and modern costumes, especially for the magnificent street parade. Material of silk, velvet, satin, gold, and silver lace and spangles, beautiful horse and pony trappings. The bandwagons are a marvel of beauty, lavishly carved with gold. All cages are finished in vermilion and gold. And this is a picture during the circus parade opening day with the bandwagon that they're describing there, pulled by 4 teams of horses. It said the employees engaged are, as usual, sober, reliable men. No drunkards are tolerated is Mr. Lee's motto. The show is rightly named by tough characters the Sunday school show. It also said, remember, no games of chance is also the motto of the great London show. Here's a picture of an elephant making his way down the street. And this picture is probably the most common, has been published the most places, but this is a picture of the wagon pulling the lions there in the cage. And if you look closely, you can see them laying in there and people watching them go through the center of town. They would usually have a parade at noontime, followed by a matinee showing in which they advertised that adults could be admitted for 25 cents and children for 15 cents. And in the evening, everyone was admitted for 25 cents. In the 1896 season, the Canton Sentinel said, "New York has its Barnum and Bailey shows, Canton has its great Charles Lee shows, and every spring there is just as much interest taken in the opening of the Lee show in Canton as in the Barnum and Bailey shows in New York, comparatively speaking. Tullis Wright, the strongest and most perfect specimen of human anatomy, is a special feature. His extraordinary exhibitions of strength are marvelous. Don't forget to see the great dive made by Captain Pierre Pereire, the French fireman, from his connecting ladders extending 100 feet in midair into his patent fire escape life-saving apparatus, the most daring feat ever attempted by mortal man. Bring the little ones in the afternoon and let them enjoy the scene of the sawdust ring, the beautiful tiny ponies and the funny dogs. Relieve their youthful hearts that are now throbbing with the expectancy of a most enjoyable day at the circus." I'm going to use that line when advertising events here at the Historical Society. Lee's circus prospered until 1896 when he suffered a severe stroke in July. And as a result, his wife had to finish out the season as manager. Lee would be confined to bed for the next 2.5 years and then to a wheelchair the rest of his life. On December 12, 1896, Charles Lee's Great London Show was sold at sheriff's sale in Phoenix, New York, and the show property that was stored in Canton was later sold by the owner. Lee died in 1905, and both he and his wife are buried in the Park Cemetery in Canton. Now, the next part of the story is very much connected to Lee's Great London Show, as are many of the things that I'll talk about tonight. And they begin with a man by the name of Charles Segrest. Charles Segrest was born Charles Patterson in 1880 in Oregon, and shortly thereafter moved to Portland. His two brothers and sister remember him tumbling before he was old enough to go to school. He soon mastered several routines and was fearless to try anything, and his friends often suffered injuries trying to copy young Charlie's stunts. He lost his mother when he was 8, and his father, who was a doctor, never returned from a call on a prospector injured in the mountains, leaving Charlie an orphan at age 9. He began selling newspapers, but wasn't too successful, so he decided that for every customer, he would do a flip-flop, somersault, or stand on his head and make change with his feet. Charlie then sold all the newspapers he could handle. One afternoon in 1890, Charlie was attracted by a crowd on a street corner where a man was performing acrobatics for whatever money the crowd would throw at him. When he was finished, Charlie jumped in the center and went through his own routine that put the man to shame. The crowd was so pleased that they were more than willing to part with more money, and young Charlie suggested to the man after the crowd left that they should team up and travel around performing their act. Of course, the man had no interest in taking on the responsibility of a young orphan boy who would potentially be running away with him, and so the man agreed to go and see Charlie's brother and at least talk to him about taking Charlie away. Charlie's brother was a little hesitant about the plan. He wanted him to stay in school, but he allowed him to work with a man whose name was John Adams, as long as Adams stayed in Portland. So they traveled around, this young boy and this man, performing at saloons and taverns and all sorts of unusual places for a boy to be in. And eventually, Charlie's brother decided to allow him to leave with the man. He could see that Charlie was very interested in joining the circus. And Charlie's brother had an eye on this gold pocket watch that Mr. Adams was carrying, and so they decided to exchange, and Charlie's brother received a gold watch in exchange for giving his brother to the guy who then left town. They worked their way down the Pacific coast to the Mexican border and then across country, and upon reaching Ogden, Utah, Adams disappeared for a few hours and came back with a legal-looking document telling Charlie that he was now adopted and was now his son. Charlie then changed his name to Patterson, from Patterson to Adams, and they continued east, taking his word for it. When Joe Adams then married, however, Charlie felt neglected, ran away while they were in New York State. He caught a freight train and rode it until he became so hungry he couldn't stand it, so he jumped off and started walking until he came to some place to eat. He had a little bit of money left, and he used the rest of it for dinner, continued walking until he came finally to a farmhouse, half-starved. He told the farmer his convincing story, and the farmer took him in, gave him a job, and allowed him to live there. Early in 1892, men showed up at the farm and posted handbills on the barn announcing the coming of Charles Lee's Great London Show to Pike, New York. Later that spring, the circus came to town, and Charlie slipped away from the farm and found the circus and Charles Lee. He asked Lee if he needed a boy in his circus and then went into his tumbling routine to demonstrate his abilities. Impressed, Lee asked him where he had come from, and Charlie told him the story. So that fall, on the way back to winter quarters, the show stopped at the farm again. Lee had a discussion with the farmer, who allowed Charlie to go on the road and leave. So Lee brought Charlie back to Canton and took a fatherly interest in him. He was allowed to live there at the house with Mr. and Mrs. Lee, and Lee put Charlie in school in order to get him an education to start with. He then bought Charlie a horse and hired a bareback rider to come from New York to spend the winter there and do nothing but train Charlie while he was not in school. The boy developed into such a first-rate rider that Lee decided to enlarge his show and feature Charlie the following season, billing him as the Boy Wonder Bareback Rider. Lee grew so attached to Charlie that he decided to adopt him and make him his heir, and upon researching Adams' purported legal document, he discovered it was a fake, and the court granted Charlie to him, and Charlie changed his name yet again to Charles Lee, Jr. The next 3 years, then, were happy ones until Lee's stroke. And even in Lee's debilitated state, his one ambition prior to his death was to get Charlie well established in the circus world. He contacted a friend, Bill O'Brien, who had one of the top acrobatic acts in show business, and placed Charlie in the O'Brien troupe. After practicing with the troupe during the winter, they joined the John Robinson Circus for the 1897 season. This is the entrance to the John Robinson Circus tent. It was while he was with this troupe, and known as Charlie O'Brien, and not yet 17 years old, that he became famous in the circus world. During this time, he learned the ground-to-ground double back, a tumbling trick that had only been done by one other person up to that time. After he conquered it, he next conquered the ground-to-ground double forward, and as a result became known as one of the greatest tumblers of all time. Next, he joined the Circus troupe, and he's shown here in this picture sitting up, the highest guy that's sitting on a pedestal there. Circus and Silben built their troupe up to 15 people, and Charlie became a great flyer during this time. He again changed his name to Charles Segrist. And James A. Bailey of Barnum and Bailey Circus gave him contracts for the big show because he recognized his ability. Now 22 years old and a famous and admired circus star, Charlie fell in love with Marie-Therese Josine Smits, a 16-year-old French girl who had joined the show in France. Charlie and Marie were married in London in April 1903, and then went to New York for the opening of the season with Barnum and Bailey at Madison Square Garden. In the coming years, they would have 2 children, Charles Jr. and Joseph. Charlie then formed his own troupe in 1908 and started his own flying act of 5 people called the Flying Neapolitans, which was so successful that Barnum and Bailey offered him a contract yet again for the troupe to join their circus, and now his dreams were fulfilled. After the act was finished on opening night, Marie ran back to her dressing room and was perspiring. She was soon in the hospital with pneumonia and died shortly after, leaving 2 young boys. Charlie finished out the season heartbroken. Now, the next season, he would go to New York to open again, and while on the way there, he stopped at Canton to see his 2 sons who were living in Canton in the Segrist house on Elm Street. Their mother, Marie, had cared for the boys when she wasn't on the road, but now Marie's mother, Octavia, was caring for the 2 boys while Charlie was on the road. Charlie would remarry in 1910 to Edith Griffey, who was much younger than he, and the same year Charlie would move his home to Canton, Ohio, so that his sons could be raised along with Edith's children from a former marriage, and they would have yet another son together in 1912. And when he entered this part of his life, one thing after another started going wrong. Charlie first had a major accident. He was struck by a steel crosspiece during his trapeze act. He was struck in the head and the face, and it caused him to drop to the net unconscious with a split skull and broken jaw. And he was some time recovering from this accident. Then his marriage went on the rocks, and he and his second wife separated. Then the stock market crashed, and he lost nearly everything. Then in April of 1931, he had his most serious accident of all. During one of his most difficult tricks, his feet struck the fly bar, causing him to plummet to the net, and his neck was broken. The rebound threw him another 15 feet to the ground, fracturing his ankle. He was carried across the street to the hospital, and doctors declared that there was no way that he would live because his spinal cord was almost severed. And should he be moved anymore, they felt it would be severed completely. An announcement was then made, since they assumed he was going to die. An announcement was made that he had died, although it was false, which put many friends into a panic, not realizing that anything had ever happened. He was placed in a plaster cast, though, where he had to remain for 14 weeks. And then the doctors ordered a steel brace for his neck that Charlie said looked like a bird cage. The doctors told him he was to remain in it for 18 months, but after wearing it for 24 hours, he concluded that he was going to return to the trapeze if it cost him his life, and at that point, he took the brace off and threw it away. After 3 months, he started practice, though it was very difficult, but he was soon back on the flying trapeze and continued to perform until the age of 67. And this is a picture of him with the flying Segrist, and has his daughter and son there who were with him at that time. He then managed the Segrist aerial team until his death in 1953 at Normal, Illinois, at the age of 72. And the next 3 pictures appeared in Parade magazine in 1943. This one shows Charlie kneeling, who is instructing his flyers at that time on the act that they would be doing. Here on the left, they're shown in winter quarters practicing their act, and on the right, Charlie's repairing a net. And obviously, this is their act. Now, Francis BRANN remembered the funeral for Charlie Siegrist. Francis was from Canton. He said, "I was stunned on the morning of the funeral services to find the funeral parlor packed to overflowing with many of the greats of the circus world. The crowd and flowers filled all of the rooms in the funeral establishment and spilled out onto the walks and lawns outside. Never have I seen so many flowers." The circus world had not forgotten Charlie. Charlie Siegrist had trained more aerial acrobats than any other man at the time. Circus men called him at age 69 the greatest living aerial artist. James A. Bailey of Barnum and Bailey Circus called him the world's greatest all-around circus performer. And John Ringling of Ringling Brothers Circus pointed Charlie out to his friends as the man who was tops in all lines, on the ground, in the air, or on a horse. Charles Siegrist was elected to the Circus Hall of Fame at Sarasota, Florida on January 15, 1966 as an all-around performer. And for years, circus performers passing through Canton would stop and visit his grave at the back of the park cemetery and pay tribute to him. And this picture shows the area where his grave is. Now, directly affecting another Canton boy who would join the circus, Charlie Siegrist had a major role in Francis BRANN's life. Francis BRANN of Canton, like all Canton children of his generation, knew Charlie Siegrist from Lee's winter training grounds in Canton. They would see him in circus parades, and many young Canton boys would dream of running away with the circus. Francis was one of these. As a young boy, Francis had been doing trapeze stunts and putting on shows in the family barn on East Main Street in Canton for the neighborhood kids. Jesse Bullock of Canton, who himself was formerly the announcer and Calliope player for Pawnee Bill's Wild West show, recommended Francis to his friend Charlie Siegrist. So when Charlie was in town just after the death of his wife, he stopped at the BRANN home and offered Francis the chance to join his troupe. Now, Francis had been expected that he would join the family meat market in Canton on Main Street, but he had no interest in being involved in that. He was very much interested in this new opportunity presented to him. His parents, however, were not too pleased with the idea, and Father Shields from St. Michael's, the family's church, was enlisted to meet young Francis at the railroad station to try and counsel him on his decision. Francis, however, boarded the train with Charlie, and the next morning they arrived in New York. They made their way quickly to Madison Square Garden, and Francis, who had never been in a large city before, was mesmerized by the sight of the circus being set up. Now, before I continue, in this picture, Charlie, there's a very light circle around his head on the right side, lower side of the picture, but these are other circus performers that he's with. Charlie immediately began training Francis, and when the show finally opened, Francis's first responsibility was to ride a horse in the opening pageant. When finished, he ducked into the wardrobe room to watch the show through a crack. What happened next would make Francis's first circus experience a very memorable one. First, an accident caused the Lamar brothers to fall from their trapeze and hit the ground, injuring both. In the excitement, several property men rushed toward that end of the arena, and one of them tripped over a guy wire steadying a 16-foot pole, atop which Herbert the Frogman was sitting with his legs twisted over his neck and down his back. He was knocked from his perch and fell to the ground on his spine, ending his circus career immediately. Next, Alfredo Codona dropped from his trapeze to the net, and the impact caused the end of the net, which was stretched over the audience, to give way, and a pulley block fell into the audience, causing minor panic and injuring a few people. And to climax the evening, The three Sylvan girls fell from their triple trapezes a short distance to the ground and had to be carried out. Francis is watching this through the crack, and Charlie comes up behind him and says, "Don't let it get to you, kid. That's all part of the business." The next thing he had to do during this opening act was to climb and do a small performance. This would be the first time that he would perform in the air before a large crowd of people. Upon climbing to his position, in the excitement, he forgot what he was supposed to do. And at the time, he somehow tripped and fell to the net, messing up his whole act. Charlie instructed him, however, to please climb back up on the platform so as not to detract from the rest of the performers and wait until the end of the act. So he did as he was supposed to, and once he got up there, he realized he didn't know how to get back down. Charlie took care of this quickly by poking him in the stomach. He doubled over and fell off and landed into the net perfectly. And this night would be his first experience with the circus. Francis started at $10 a week and learned that in order to add to your wages, you needed to enlarge your scope in the performing arts. He was willing to try anything, and he graduated to catching the flyers, then riding two horses while standing with one foot on the back of each horse as they raced around the tent. He also did a turn as parade marshal and also in juggling acts. Circus life was definitely interesting for Francis. He once discussed Boston and a hotel which was frequented by show business folks where he stayed. He said, "I lived at the old Revere House about 1910, and the guy next door had a python in his bathtub. And next to him was a kangaroo practicing boxing. They had about every animal act there in the rooms." In the course of searching for new acts, he met a man named Frankie Silvis, who was a master at balancing another acrobat on top of a long pole. This was called a perch act, and it would eventually become his professional career. Francis performed with a Circus troupe in the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus until he was drafted into the Army. This is him in his uniform. During his time with Ringling Brothers, Francis became friends with a man named Cy Compton. Cy Compton was the man who was in charge of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and they often visited other shows, Cy and Francis together, to watch other acts. While doing that one day, one girl caught Cy's eye as she was a real show person, and Cy said, "Why don't anybody like that ever come to work for me?" They said no more about it and went on their way. A week later, after finishing a matinee, Francis was headed to the cookhouse when someone told him he would have to, that he would save a long walk by taking a shortcut through the big tent. As he approached the tent door, a girl stopped and asked where to find the man who hired the Wild West people. Francis recognized the girl as the person who he and Cy saw a week earlier. Francis took her to the dressing room, and Cy hired her immediately. Her name was AMELIA LAPELL, but from then on, she would be known as Mill. She was an accomplished rider and quickly mastered such tricks as picking up a handkerchief with her mouth while riding at full gallop. Buffalo Bill, who's pictured here, once visited the circus in Cheyenne to talk with Compton, and Mill was introduced to him. Compton told Cody that Mill is the best cowgirl I ever had. And Cody patted her shoulder and said, "You look like you'll be good at anything you try to do." Now, Mill was of Spanish ancestry, but she was born in France. She was brought to America at the age of 11 to live with an aunt while her parents settled in Brazil. The aunt died, and Mill was moved from orphanage to orphanage until she found a home with a Scottish woman in Denver. The woman's sister, however, was cruel, and so Mill decided to run away with the circus. And so she ran away with Barnum and Bailey's in 1916 to become a trick rider with their Wild West show. She was described as a stunning, exotic, dark-haired cowgirl straight out of Paris. She was described by Variety magazine as a looker, and by Billboard magazine as having an enviable carriage. A newspaper in Maine described her as particularly pretty, a brunette of the Spanish type. Mill was offered a motion picture contract, but Butch told her that he would marry her if she did not go to California. And during World War I, when Francis was at Camp Meade and the Circus had come to Baltimore, he got a 36-hour pass, went to Baltimore, and they were married by the chancellor of the Catholic diocese in the presence of Charlie Segrist and his wife Edith. And this is them on their wedding day. Bush was discharged from the service, having attained the rank of lieutenant when World War I ended in 1918. He then went to work practicing the Perch Act with Frankie Silvas, and then Mill learned how to perform on top of the pole. A few years later, the two left the circus, worked up their own act, and entered vaudeville, appearing now as France and LaPELL. In the late 20s, Mill took a break while she was pregnant with a little girl. Unfortunately, the child died of blue baby syndrome and was buried in St. Michael's Cemetery in Canton. Butch was now what Francis would be called, and Mill went back on the road and performed their Perch Act. This is a picture of them performing the act. And the pole and the bicycle that are in the picture are right here on display for you. Billboard magazine described their act. In the Perch Act, the girl uses a bicycle arrangement atop a rigid 15-foot pole balanced in flag-bearer fashion by the man and performs headstands and balancing bits. And when they say flagpole fashion or flag-bearer fashion, they're talking about Butch, who's there at the bottom of the picture, who's wearing a harness like you might wear to carry a flag in a parade with, and that's how he's holding the pole. That's a close-up of Butch holding it. Now, I got to tell you, I've moved that pole full length, and it is heavy. So I don't have any idea how Butch could do that. But he had a lot of muscle, obviously. And a close-up of her at the top of the pole. In this case, she's doing a headstand off the seat. If you look at the seat tonight before you leave, it's made in such a way as to center your head on the seat. The wheels are stationary, so they don't turn, but the handlebars turn, and allows her then to move into position however she needed to do it. Billboard magazine continued, the next series in the act is on a bamboo perch, which is even higher, surmounted by a bar arrangement. After some neat balancing at its summit, the girl descends several feet to a loop for rigid poles with a single foothold. She closes with some stunts on a stiff trapeze apparatus, still being held by Butch, which is laying on the floor up here. The highlight is 5 forward and 2 reverse swings on the trapeze while Butch is holding it in the air. I just can't even imagine it. But over here against the wall is another piece of the pole, but at the top is that piece that they're describing where she put her foot in, which held her in place as she performed at the top of the pole. So that piece actually goes on top of the pole, and the bike goes on top of the pole, and they were interchangeable as they needed to be. France and LaPELL named their act In the Air. One newspaper said, balancing atop a slender pole, Miss LaPELL in a series of perch tricks with her own mid-air frolic gives a thrill indeed. And Billboard magazine said, the girl's work is graceful and sensational. About 1941, they had been doing their act as France and LAPELL for 20 years, and according to Butch, it was getting worn out. He said, the kids would sit down front and tell us what we were going to do next. They decided to go south of the border, and when they came back, they had changed their name to Francisco and Dolores. They wore Spanish costumes now as part of the new act, including large sombreros. And they spent the next 15 years until retirement doing the same act, but getting more renewed interest in it because of the new costumes and the new name, perhaps. In 1947, they joined the Roy Rogers Thrill Circus and continued as Francisco and Dolores. So this picture, which is taken out of the circus program, shows them performing their act. And this is them using the bamboo pole, which flexes as she is flying around in the air. But the top piece, if you look closely, is this top piece on this pole right here. That's how she's being held up there. Now, they were good friends with Roy Rogers, and here she is with Roy Rogers. In fact, during their career, they became good friends with a lot of people. George Burns and Gracie Allen often appeared on the same bill as France and LAPELL. Mill was a close friend of Gracie Allen, and they often went shopping together in New York between shows. Other close friends who they knew even before these people became famous were Bing Crosby, Andy Devine, Jack Benny, Paul Whiteman, and Jimmy Durante. In the mid-40s, during one of their performances in the Commodore Theater in New York, Butch slipped on the stage, and Mill was whirling at the top of the pole, and when he slipped, she came crashing to the stage and was severely injured. Durante, who was seated in the front row, leaped on stage, calmed the audience, and sang to complete their 7 minutes of performance, so that they would be paid. Otherwise, they wouldn't be paid. Francisco and Dolores appeared many times on television's Big Top and several times on The Ed Sullivan Show. They were close friends of Gentleman Jim Corbett, a boxer who was heavyweight champion of the world from 1892 to 1896. And also they were friends with Jack Dempsey, who held the heavyweight title from 1919 to 1926. Mill appeared in several motion pictures, including Crime Without Passion with Claude Rains in 1934, Night Angel with Frederick March, and Doris Rankin, who was Harry Davenport's sister-in-law, in 1931. And she made a French picture at the old Astoria Studios on Long Island. She also appeared in Jumbo, a Broadway hit. Francisco and Dolores performed in London in 1953 during the coronation ceremonies for Queen Elizabeth II. Their last show was in Dallas in 1956. Butch was 64 and Mill was 59, still climbing the pole. They retired in 1960 and made their home in Sarasota, Florida, the circus capital of the world. And on the left is Butch there at Sarasota. However, they spent their summers in Canton, and on the right is Mill, pictured in Canton. They also bought a house on East Main Street across the street from Butch's childhood home, where his dream of joining the circus first started, and continued to return to Canton until Butch's death in 1988 at the age of 95. And as for Mill, even in her late 80s, when the circus was mentioned, Mill would stand and demonstrate her flexibility by bending over and putting her head between her knees. Mill died in 1992 at the age of 94, and both are buried in St. Michael's Cemetery in Canton along with their daughter. Now, somewhere around 1910, Casper and Mab Weiss, who would be called little people today, but who were commonly referred to as midgets back then, made their way to visit Canton. And the purpose for their visit was to see Mab's mother, Octavia, who was caring for Mab's sister's children, because Charlie Segrist's wife, Marie, was a sister to Mab Weiss. They soon purchased a summer home in Canton that would later become their full-time home. But the story of Caspar and Mab Weiss is an interesting one. Caspar was born in 1872 in Rhineland specifically, but his birthplace is many times given as Luxembourg. His mother was of normal size, and his father was 6 feet tall. Of 8 children, only Caspar and a sister were midgets. He learned the watchmaker's trade when he was very young at the insistence of his father, and was a graduate of a German watchmaking school where he became a master at his profession. His tiny fingers made him well suited for the job. One day, a musical comedy show arrived in his town, and one of the midget performers was taken ill, so the troupe director was looking for someone to fill his place. He heard that there was a small individual in town that could sing and dance, which turned out to be Caspar Weiss. Caspar soon found that he was paid much more for his work with the troupe than he was as a watchmaker. He got his parents' permission and left town then with the troupe. When it came time for him to serve in the army, the German government put him to work taking care of the compasses and the delicate instruments on board a warship. He soon tired of this and secured 5 months' leave of absence and came to America in 1895 with the Lilliputian troupe. When his leave was up, Caspar simply decided not to go back. Germany, obviously, began looking for him as they felt he was necessary for the war effort. But he appealed to the German consul at Philadelphia and New York, and finally the German army decided that they would survive without him. He was allowed to remain in America. He then made his way to Connecticut and continued the watchmaking trade, later moved to Philadelphia, where he was employed as the head watchmaker for Litt Brothers in this building and resided with Mr. Litt while he worked there. Caspar was made a Mason in 1901 and also took 6 degrees in the Oddfellows Lodge. He would be a life member of 3 different Philadelphia Masonic lodges for the rest of his life, and he was known as the smallest Shriner in the world. And some of his things from the lodge are over here on display tonight. In 1904, he went back into acting by getting a job as a band leader in a place called Midget City, located inside of Dreamland, an amusement park which opened on Coney Island that year. Now, Jane, also spelled Jeannie, Madeleine Duvain, was born in Paris, France in 1883. When her mother remarried, Jane assumed her stepfather's last name of Smits. At birth, Mab weighed 1 pound, 1 1/4 ounces, and she was less than 8 inches long. Her mother was able to slip her wedding band over Mab's arm all the way to her shoulder. At age 7, she began touring different countries with her mother and manager and performing. Because she was so small, she was given the stage name of Queen Mab, the name of a fairy referred to in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. She could speak French, German, and English. While touring Europe, she met James Bailey of Barnum and Bailey Circus, who brought her to America in 1902, and she traveled with Barnum and Bailey Circus for some time before finally ending up at Coney Island and was hired to work at Dreamland. Now, Dreamland was a theme park built on Coney Island. It was built by a former state senator, William H. Reynolds, in 1904. It was intended to top all other Coney Island attractions. The park was massive and was complete with what they called a midget community. It also had a big top circus, roller coasters, and freak shows unlike any other. Lilliputian was the midget city, and it was a permanent experimental community inside Dreamland. It was designed to look like old Nuremberg in the 15th century. It measured 80 by 170 feet and was home to 300 midgets. The city was entirely built at half scale, so it would be completely in their size. They had their own parliament in this city. They had an opera house, which is shown here, and they had their own beach, complete with a lifeguard, all in miniature size. They even had their own fire department with miniature equipment that responded every hour to a false alarm, shown here. To make the city even more of a spectacle, park owners encouraged, quote, social experimentation. As a result of this social experimentation, marriages in the city collapsed almost as soon as they were celebrated, and 80% of babies born in Midget City were illegitimate. Casper and Mab had 2 children. The first born premature and died within 2 hours. The second was born and lived a day and a half. According to the physician's medical report read before the Philadelphia Medical Society in 1904, this was, quote, the first case of a Lilliputian child being born to Lilliputian parents to be born alive. The doctor also noted that Casper looked like a boy of 10 years old, and Mab seemed like a girl of 9 or 10 years old. He also noted that she wished to be amused, so she was joking around too much. In May of 1911, the lighting system short-circuited in Dreamland, and the entire park was consumed by fire in 3 hours. But it was in that kind of environment, in this social experimentation, that Casper and Mab met. And although it was not ideal conditions for the start of a long-lasting relationship, the two were married in 1906 in New York City. Casper once said that they wanted to be married in New York's little church around the corner, but couldn't find it. He explained that the church was not listed in the directory by that name, so they were married in a Methodist church. The minister was so tall, he had to sit in a chair while performing the ceremony. They left Coney Island, continued their show business career, performing in vaudeville and musical shows throughout the United States and Europe. They were known as the most famous midget couple in the world. Mab was known as the smallest actress in the world, and at a performance in Chicago, they had to prove their age because officials thought they were violating child labor laws. In 1907, Casper became manager of the Litt Brothers Free Theater and was also manager of the famous Lilliputian Company. As their popularity increased, they appeared before Queen Victoria of England, the Tsar of Russia, and the President of France. Audiences in all sections of the United States, Canada, and Cuba knew them, and this is a piece of sheet music that had their picture on it. So you know you're famous when your picture appears on sheet music. After visiting Mab's sister in Canton, the Weisses decided to purchase a summer home there. Casper was known as a good businessman and had saved a good sum of money. In 1911, they purchased a 17-room house known as Hillside that had belonged to Fanny Davenport, a sister of Harry Davenport, and they would spend their summers here and then go back on the road during the winter. One room in the house was completely furnished in miniature furniture, The rest of the house was furnished with full-size furnishings, including the kitchen, where the stove had a special platform built around it so Mab could do her own cooking. In 1917, they retired from show business, and Casper devoted his full time to watchmaking business he had and opened a business in his home. He repaired watches for clients all across the U.S. and was official watch repairman for the Altoona Railroad shops. While living in Canton, they were members of the First Presbyterian Church, and he became a member of the Canton Moose Lodge. Casper and Mab often went out to Sunday dinner at the Packard Hotel in Canton, where Mab would sit atop a couple of cushions on a regular chair where she would be level with everyone else. Casper, however, only needed one cushion. Their home was destroyed by fire on Sunday, October 14th, 1951, with a total loss of $50,000. Billboard magazine reported occupants and neighbors removed most of the furniture, watchmaking equipment, a collection of old clocks, and a piano once used by General Tom Thumb, another noted midget. They lost much of their theatrical records and equipment, along with clothes specially made for them and furniture on the second floor. Mrs. Weiss lost considerable money, which she had stored in the house. They lived the next 2 years with Robert and Eleanor Elliott, while Robert converted a barn into an apartment for them next door to their former home. On their 48th anniversary, more than 100 friends and neighbors greeted the Weisses, and hundreds of cards and floral arrangements were also sent. It was reported that the decorated wedding cake was sized to the bride's dainty proportions, but inadequate for the crowd of well-wishers who were served decorated individual cakes and other refreshments. Casper died in 1965 at the age of 92, and Mab died in 1973 at the age of 89. Both are buried in Park Cemetery in Canton. Now, another Canton person, and we could go on all night, but this is the last one I'll talk about. Harry SILL was perhaps one of the best known in later years as a school bus driver for Towanda School District, and owned a fleet of charter buses. But in his early boyhood, Harry moved with his parents to Mansfield, and from there to Canton, where he graduated from Canton High School in 1929. After graduation, Harry enlisted in the Army, and by the time that he was honorably discharged, the Depression was on, and jobs were scarce. Frank Peeler of Canton, who was a showman himself, suggested a show career for Harry, and he took the suggestion. He went to New York and began a vaudeville and circus career. Harry developed what was known as the forward Mexican foot slide, a very dangerous act. He met a former New York City policeman named Jack McCarthy, who was known as the strongest policeman in the world. The two put together a vaudeville act known as Jack and Sill's Chills and Thrills. This was a perch act where Harry did stunts atop a 30-foot pole, which Jack balanced on his forehead. A very similar act to France and LAPELL here with the pole, but they interchanged how they held the pole. They traveled all over the United States performing this act. When Jack McCarthy left the act, it broke up, and Harry went with Burt Lancaster and Nick Cravat, creating an act called The Three Toppers. For 4 years, they did a balancing act, working mostly out of Chicago, and at times they worked with Ozzie and Harriet and with Red Skelton. The act became so popular that it was signed by the Hagenbeck and Wallace Circus, and later was with Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus for an entire season. In this photo, on the left is Burt Lancaster, Nick in the middle, and then on the right side is Harry. the last time that they performed was in Los Angeles, and the three of them went to Hollywood for screen tests, but Harry subsequently returned home to take care of his family. The other two went on and worked together several times in movies, including this 1952 movie entitled The Crimson Pirate. And Burt Lancaster, obviously, became a popular and talented actor and visited Harry in Canton over the years. Harry also became very skilled with the high stilts, and at one time was one of the best-known stilt walkers in America. Three times, garbed in Uncle Sam costume, he led the Macy's parade down Broadway from 110th Street to 34th Street. His stilts were over 13 feet high. The last time he performed was in 1945. Although other Bradford County towns had circus people and circus connections, there are perhaps none that have as many world-famous circus performers, which is why it was accurately called the circus capital of the East. Thank you. And just a couple of things. Feel free to check out this equipment that's laying around. There's some back there. Part of their trapeze act is leaning against the wall. There's poles and stuff, and there's a case up here with some other juggling type things in it. And Francis's harness is also in there, so feel free to check those things out. And also, I'd like to say thank you. There was a lot of people that donated pictures, information, all sorts of things, or loaned things in order to put this together. And a lot of stuff I didn't know about, so I learned a few things, and thank you for that.